Welcome to Mind, Money, Balance, the no guilt, no shame podcast to help you get your mind and money in balance. I'm your host, Lindsay. I'm a financial therapist and coach, woman of color, and popcorn connoisseur. I am so glad you're here. Let's go. Today's podcast guests are Curt and Katie Vernoy. They are both licensed marriage and family therapists in the Los Angeles area and co-hosts of the Modern Therapist Survival Guide podcast. They are also the creators of the Therapy Reimagined conference, which brings together modern therapists to talk about how to build out practices that welcome diversity, integrate technology and business systems, engage in advocacy for other therapists, and how to grow as clinicians by incorporating deliberate self-care practices and deliberate therapeutic practices, digging into our own stuff. They have created successful private practices, and they are both actively involved in the profession in a myriad of ways. Together, we are going to talk about how they talk about money as a team, how they lead with their values, and where and how they agree on spending or not spending money in their businesses, and getting comfortable with imperfection. Before we get into the podcast, I just want to give them both a huge shout out. They are both white and they both use their privilege and their platform to talk about hard stuff, and they really walk the walk as allies and co-conspirators for folks who are in different marginalized groups. I mean, recently on their podcast, they have talked about the rise of white nationalism and extremism. They have talked about the pros and cons of the vaccine and how to be ethical when you talk about it with your clients and what you can and cannot do in your practice. They really tackle tough stuff, and they really lead by example. I just want to give them a huge shout out for really using their privilege and their platform for good. Tune in, buckle up. This is going to be a great episode. All right, welcome to Curt and Katie. Thank you so much for coming on to the Mind, Money, Balance podcast.
Woo! Glad to be here.
I like
Thanks
that
for having
enthusiastic woo. Yeah, I can get behind that. Well, I was saying right before we hit record that I have been a fan of your work for a very long time. And so having the opportunity to be a speaker at the Therapy Reimagined conference and to be a guest on your podcast was such a highlight. And it feels so exciting to have you guys here on my show. And also, I'm a touch nervous. So thank you for coming on and sharing all of your wisdom with our listeners. So I'll pick on you, Curt, because I can see you first. Why don't you tell me a little bit about how the two of you came to become business partners? Fill us in.
A lot of this started with LA traffic and just being bored in LA traffic. I would call people that I know. I'd make up reasons to call them. And one day, Katie picked up the phone and
I don't know why I did. I don't know why I picked up the phone. I just did.
But what it led to was the two of us being able to work together on the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists Board of Directors. And through our time working together on that, we found that we had more and more of a common interest of where the field should be going. And Katie came to me one day. She's like, I want to do something more. I want to do a podcast or put on an event or something. And we kind of said, well, why don't we do both? And from there, we started to build the idea of creating what ultimately became the Therapy Reimagined conference and the Modern Therapist Survival Guide podcast.
Awesome. So the two of you guys essentially had been colleagues and found that you wanted to do more than just talk about the things that were going on in your world. And you guys cultivated both a massive conference that is just stacked full of some of the most progressive minds in the therapy world and a podcast. So Katie, Curt said, okay, we're going to go big. We're going to do this conference. We're going to do this podcast. And you were obviously collaborating on this together. Is your energy more or less pretty aligned, you and Curt?
I think it is aligned, but it's actually more complementary. tree. I think oftentimes what I found is when I was ready to go big, Curt was like, let's think about this for a second. And when he was like, okay, we have to do this thing, I'm like, yes, and maybe we should look at this other thing. And so I think we've found over the years that the energy is sustainable only because one or the other of us have it. I think when we've gotten into trouble, it's when both of us are like, yeah. And then we're like, oh, wait, hang on. Where are we?
Oh my gosh. So I heard a lot of therapist language. Yes, and let's like just take a look. Let's zoom out. So kind of wearing your therapist hat along with your business hat. So which came first, the podcast or the conference?
Surprisingly, the conference did in our minds. So the conference actually was about a little less than a year into the podcast, but we decided, hey, we want to teach therapists better than they're often taught, especially around continuing education. We saw really boring stuff. We saw a lot of old white guys, and we saw a lot of stuff where the same people were being brought to the conferences over and over and over again. So we wanted to step out, and we're like, okay, so about 100 people know who we are right now. And so I think we need to start having these conversations and have a podcast, because that's the only way we're going to actually be able to grow an audience. And we thought they were completely connected, but they're actually, they're similar, and there's kind of an intersection between the two audiences, but they actually grew on their own. They each have their life of their own. But the podcast initially was the marketing mechanism for the conference.
Got it. And where did you guys learn all of this business acumen? How did you guys get to where you are today? Was it books? Was it podcasts? Trial and error?
I think at least from my end, I grew up in Montana in the 4-H program. And
So tell people who aren't from rural America what 4-H is. I grew up in the thumb of Michigan, so I know what it is.
So 4-H is this project-based educational system. And for most of what people know it as is kind of the livestock end of things. But I never had livestock in the program. And so I did a lot of other projects that through all of my youth, I was doing things like photography, but a big piece of these projects was planning out expenses, tracking income that was made from these projects, keeping things very, very organized. So I grew up in kind of this financially responsible mindset. And therefore, when I ended up finishing grad school, and it was really easy for me because I already had kind of that mindset to start my practice and start my business. Katie has her whole coaching system and everything else that she'll explain here, but it just allowed for us to kind of, again, complementary come together.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I was a director in public mental health. And so there was a lot of budgets, people, and there was a lot of things that I had to consider as a clinician that I did not consider when I was just starting out. And I think a lot of people will start a private practice or start a business prior to having any of that experience. And I was able to manage up to other people's budgets and to be able to identify what was best. So to me, it was something where being able to tap into Curt's knowledge with the additional knowledge that I had was helpful.
Love that. So you guys each had your own unique background that was, it sounds, Curt, to me like you had a lot of personal finance knowledge, and Katie, you had a lot of kind of the nonprofit business financial knowledge.
Yeah.
And so then those two worlds combined pretty seamlessly. How did you guys discuss the financials of becoming business partners?
We really went into it with the hope of let's not lose money. And that was kind of our starting conversation.
Always a good goal.
But I had a failed business partnership with another person several years ago. And entering into this relationship with Katie and entering in as partners, I took the experience of what had previously gone sour before. And we were very upfront about we need to talk about money regularly. We need to have it be a part of our regular conversations. We want to feel like we're both investing the money piece together. And that way we're not going to develop bad feelings of monetarily, one of us is contributing way more. And so just making a regular conversation about here's what our investments are, here's how we're spending, that made it a healthy conversation to where there wasn't a lot of bad feelings developing.
And I think then the addition, and this is, I think, been more recently, is recognizing that investment is not just money, it's also time. I honestly think that money is a tool to buy you some time, right? Like you work to make money so that you can have time to do other things. And so when we were talking this year, especially as the world has continued to change, we also, and this conversation is still in progress, but talking about how much time investment and looking at how do we value that? How do we make sure we honor that? There's some new offerings we're thinking about and looking at, kind of creation. And it's become more of a complicated conversation because in truth, money isn't just money, right? It's not just that piece. And so we're still a work in progress, but I found that because we've been having those deliberate conversations throughout the whole partnership, I think being able to have this nuanced conversation about how much time we're spending, what kind of time we're spending, even kind of intellectual property and the things that we're bringing to the relationship, even if it's clunky, even if it has gone off the path, we're able to come back and say, okay, how are we going to straighten this out? What is the thing here? And the agreement always gets to, we're going to make sure that we both feel comfortable. We're going to make sure we both understand how this is. And even kind of what's yours, what's mine, what's ours, kind of really continuing that conversation very, very consciously, because it's very sensitive and it can lead to bad feelings. And so the fact that I know that if there's something going on, I can say, hey, Curt, we got to talk about this again. And he says, all right, let's buckle in. Here we go. Yeah. We always come out feeling, I think, really good about it, even if we went in not necessarily having a clear sense of where we were going to start.
Okay. So how do you work through those uncomfortable money conversations when you do have either differing opinions on how something should be rolled out or on, how dividends should be paid out? Like, how do you actually have that conversation? It sounds like you guys have some sort of structure or plan that looks like we sit down, we have a talk, we look for an outcome, but what does that look like?
So we're still very much in growth mode. So the dividends piece getting paid out is a future place, and that's something. So really, a lot of what comes into this is when we need to make further investments as partners.
Got it.
And so a lot of those conversations look like, hey, it looks like our budgets are going to need some sort of boost while we're waiting for the next sponsorships to come in, while we're making the next website development, while we're doing the next growth phase towards content creation. And a lot of times we end up researching what those expenses end up being. We project out what the kinds of investments are that would still leave us with a safety buffer to continue to pay our contractors and our infrastructure bills. And we say, all right, it's my turn to invest more because I'm behind, or it's your turn to invest more because we go through our books every couple of months and really make sure that it feels like we're both evenly contributing. And if it does get out of balance, we try to make steps to bring it back into balance as quickly and intentionally as possible.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the shared values that drive those business investment decisions?
I think the biggest thing is both Curt and I are very conscious around high quality education, mm-hmm. as well as not necessarily avoiding the costs that would create, very high quality things, but also recognizing that we're not going to throw a ton of money at something early on. And so it's balancing the desire for something that's really amazing with the responsibility, I think, that both of us grew up with, which is if you don't have the money, don't spend it. Right. And so I think that there's conscious decisions around hiring. We definitely make sure that we're hiring, a diverse set of speakers. We look at all of our contractors and we look at all of the people that are with us and making sure that we feel good about the ethics of each person, and we continue to assess those things. I think the biggest piece, though, is really this notion of what can we do ourselves? What do we need to delegate? Kind of how do we balance that desire for a really high quality product, whether it's the conference or the podcast or other things that are coming through the pipeline, as well as not needing to get angel investors and, kind of things that are going to set us too far off on a path where we won't be able to kind of pay our bills.
Got it. So what I'm hearing there is that the end goal is really high quality education. And underneath that umbrella also includes making sure that you are bringing on people that are ethically in alignment with the values of the business that the two of you have created, and then spending from there in alignment with those values. So it's all kind of underneath the same thing, which is go back to the mission statement, as it were, and make sure that our money is being spent in alignment with that mission statement. I mean, so that's like the type of thing that I teach my clients, and it is also very hard for a lot of people to wrap their minds around, because so much of the way that we are taught about money, if at all, is very much like, look at what your expenses are, make sure you can afford to cover those expenses. But the idea of values is usually something that is pretty foreign when it comes to personal finance spending. And we're getting better at talking about it and dialoguing about it. But how did the two of you guys land there on being really values-based spending and investing? And when I'm talking about investing, I'm talking about the types of investment you guys had mentioned.
I think for us, a big piece of it is that we both have the thumbs in a number of pies. And there's
That's a weird visual, Curt. I'm just going to say.
several thumbs all over the place. But what it has really done is, as Katie mentioned earlier, there's the yours, mine, and ours conversations that we have. And so having the opportunity to really hone in on what's the ours together piece allows for us to better distinguish between what's stuff going on in my projects, what's stuff going on her projects, what's the stuff that we're really working on together. And having that distinction of values and that intentionality of the partnership having a set of values that we're working on together allows for us to follow that. And it's something where if we do have things that are starting to encroach upon, well, is this mine or is this ours? That we're really able to go back to that mission statement and to our values to say, this is why this fits in this place. And that's why we're going to follow this line of thinking and this investment strategy with it.
Well, and even taking it kind of at a higher level, I know for me in the work that I do in my consulting, I always want to get to the why question. One of the first things as an entrepreneur I watched was Simon Sinek talking about, kind of what's your why, and why that specific question needs to be answered in order to have a successful business. And I think for Curt and me, the why at first was because it sounds like fun, but we quickly realized that something that sounds like fun, but actually is a huge amount of work, needs to have a mission to drive it. And so being able to pull out into the mission statement and really get down into the values that we're espousing, we knew we had to do that to be able to make this sustainable. Like, this is a big picture, long-term project. It's not like a get-rich-quick scheme, like at all. And so I think that was huge to me. Like, we needed to be aware of that. And I think just to kind of amplify part of what Curt was saying is that as an individual, and this goes to like, we both have personal brands, and then we also have our joint brand. Like, I have to be the same person at each table. So the values are similar, but then the mechanism, the vehicle to support those values is different. And I think it does help us to make decisions of where things fall. And so if I'm going to make an investment in my practice, or, whether it's consulting or therapy, like, I'm going to figure out where that fits in that regard, and be able to distinguish when it's actually something that fits better under the umbrella that Curt and I are building. If that makes sense. I feel like I'm getting a little bit in the weeds.
No, it makes perfect sense. And it, again, it's so interesting to see. I mean, what I hear when I listen to the two of you is just how intentional this has all been. You didn't just snap your fingers and go, okay, we're going to have this conference and have this podcast, and maybe we'll figure out how to spend and pay our vendors as we go. You were very intentional about it. And I'm curious for folks out there who maybe didn't have the same messaging about money growing up, or maybe didn't have experiences in private practice first or in consulting first, what were some of the maybe mistakes or growing points that you had before you guys started on these two journeys or these two brands together? What were some of the maybe financial or money mindset mistakes that you had to overcome or learn from?
Go ahead.
Chris, like, I'm abdicating this right now. No, I'm just kidding. Well, I mean, we've been very intentional, but that doesn't mean that we haven't had some of those, let's leap in, have a big goal, and hope for the best.
Mhm.
And I think that's something that we still grapple with, because I think that if you really look at all of the things that are involved in putting on a large event or in a past, like, I think most people wouldn't do it. And so, like, that kind of leap and then kind of make sure that you fill in, I think that still there's some of that. And I think that that's something that I've definitely continued to have in my own kind of money stories, is kind of hoping and trusting that it'll work out in the end, and then feeling terrified that it's not going to, and then going back and forth between let's do this and then let's figure it out. For me, I think that's the part that continues to be a struggle, because I think it is something where, you almost have to have this belief without any proof that something's going to work.
Mm-hmm. So am I hearing from you then, Katie, that one of the barriers when it comes to growing this business is sometimes that you do have to leap before you know something is 100% solid? And
yes,
is it fair to say that one of the ways that manifests is ruminating and checking and things like that?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So many nights of waking up at like 3 a.m, just being like, oh, there's a lot of stress about this.
Yeah. So, Curt, what about for you? So Katie said for her, some of the things she kind of continues to run into is that anxiety of what if, I guess if I were to try and finish that sentence, it might be, what if this doesn't work out? What if we lose this money? Is that the fear there, Katie? Or
yes.
Yeah. Okay. So for Curt, I'm curious about what are some of the money mindset issues that have come up for you, or that you have worked through or have continued to work on?
I think one of the big things that we both come back to is something that Katie mentioned a little bit earlier, is the way that we also value the time that we put in. And I think that we're fortunate enough to come into this partnership with our practices and our other jobs and tasks, being able to make sure that we're sustained as people as far as our personal bills go. As we come together and we use some of the places that we've come from and our investments into the business, that it's going to be something that's sustainable. And it's not like we have this destination point where it's like, all right, all of our money is going to be spent and we're going to be done at this conference and forevermore. But it's being able to look both kind of short term with the projects that we want to do, but also long term sustainably, that we can't overdo it on this project because we've still got to be able to pay bills continuing to go forward. And so it's being able to wrestle with, we need to do what's best in the short term and the long term for us. And that's part of where, we can chase the shiny, fancy things, but at what cost? And that's a conversation that we tend to come to over and over again.
Okay. Wow. Again, I'm hearing so much intentionality around the way that you guys do your work. So I'm curious, from what I see, you guys have your podcast, you have a Facebook group, you offer like free happy hours for therapists, you have the conference, and you each said earlier, Curt, you have your thumbs in more than one thing. So this is just one part of the work that you do. I'm so curious, with all of the things happening, when do you decide, or have you had to make the decision before, where, hey, we've been putting our time and energy and maybe money as well into this specific project and it's no longer serving us? When do you decide that something isn't beneficial to continue?
We've been, I guess, kind of aware of our businesses long enough that we can kind of look at general trends that happen throughout the year. And again, this comes back to intentionality. We both know our practices kind of are going to dip anyway during Thanksgiving week. That's a week to kind of take off and recharge for ourselves. Katie is phenomenal at like, I'm going to go to the mountains and I'm not going to be available for like 72 hours. And it's really being able to follow the natural flows of the business that we have, that, and vice versa, knowing when our practices are going to be phenomenally busy. My private practice works mostly with teenagers. So like 3 weeks after the start of the school year, my phone is ringing off the hook with parents calling in. I have teaching schedules that I teach at a couple of universities in the LA area, that it's all right. When I'm teaching, I have less time available. So it's being able to look at the global way that everything relates, to pick, here's the times when we're going to be able to really invest our time and energy. Here's the times when we intentionally have to step back, either to recharge or because we have other things going on in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And just to kind of take that and extrapolate out, because I think one of the parts of the question is, when do you kind of call it quits on something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think, as you heard in what Curt was talking about, there is that kind of 4-dimensional chess of when is each of us available, how much time and energy we have to invest, and that kind of stuff. And there's been like smaller projects within Therapy Reimagined that we started and then backed away from. There are things that we're considering as we move forward, and we're really assessing all of those same pieces. Like, in the flow of the year, can we actually do this? Are we getting money and a return on investment? And I think it's hard because there's stuff that we really like doing. Like, we were really enjoying happy hours every week, but we realized it was not sustainable. So we stopped, kind of on the run up to the conference, and found out people loved it. We're like, okay, well, let's bring this back once a month. We had one, as we're recording, like it was just a few days ago. It was Friday, and it's awesome. But when we were doing it weekly, people weren't showing up every week. And so like, if we just do it once a month, it's going to be great. And and then it's also identifying what's the actual goal? How much do we actually have to invest? I mean, I think that there's no perfect thing. And I think as we continue forward with the conference, each year we evaluate, is the time and money that we're investing, is it worth it? And we've always come to yes, but that may not always be the case. I mean, I think it's something where our lives change, the seasons change, and I think that there's also sustainability issues sometimes when things are, shifting and changing. And there was a huge fear when COVID hit, not knowing what was really going to happen. We had a big hotel contract set for 2 months ago that we fortunately were able to get out of, but that was a huge discussion that we had right at the beginning of the pandemic. What do we do if the hotel holds us to this contract? Because we're not bringing 350 people together in a hotel. Right. And so there's these hard conversations that speak to the financial return on investment, but also, are we heading in a direction we still agree with? Is this something that we still want? So there's kind of the mission and the vision. And then it's also, is it sustainable for us individually? Do we have the time for it? And we've adjusted things in order to be able to kind of sustain within the capacities that we have as a very small conference company. So it's interesting. I mean, there are things that we've considered and dropped very quickly, and there's things that we have to keep looking at, because there are so many different elements to it. And given all of the thumbs and all of the pies, Curt keeps talking, it is kind of like 4-dimensional chess.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like it. And it again just sounds so intentional. And that is going to be like the big theme and the big takeaway. And for people listening who are like, Curt and Katie, you guys sound like where I want to be with my money mindset in 10 years. I would just be curious about what advice you might offer to somebody who thinks that the relationship that you've cultivated with money is impossible. What nuggets of wisdom or pieces of advice would you lend to someone who feels like the idea of doing money intentionally is impossible?
I think a big piece of it is getting over the fear of talking about it. There's a lot of things to be super uncomfortable about when talking about money. But the fact of talking about money, once you get past that piece of the uncomfortable thing, then you start talking about what that money can do for you. And whether it is a return on your investment, whether it is towards a mission, whether it is to have fun, that being able to get over yourself and talk about money and talk about money together is such a critical piece of this. And it gets easier and easier. So it's now when Katie and I are like, okay, it's time to have one of the money talks, it's just like, all right, it's just another thing on the calendar. It's not like a huge, what's going to come out of this? Are we going to look and there's going to be no money? Is it going to cost me money? It's just another part of our day-to-day business.
Awesome.
And I think to make it more approachable, because I'm hearing you say it's so intentional. It's so intentional. It's like, it is. And I think if we actually go back to intention, it is Curt's and my intention to be very deliberate in how we do these things. But we don't always succeed. I think there are times when we have gone down a road and we're like, whoa, that was a way more expensive than we thought. And, or it was way imbalanced and we didn't realize it was getting there. And it was something where our intention, we recognize that our intention is to be fair and balanced. Our intention is to be responsible and make sure that we're really focusing on our values and ethics and all of those things. But we do get off base and we do get busy. I mean, we were in a pandemic and we had all of the other things to deal with. And, we had to remind ourselves, wait a second, we got to come back to this. But I think when you speak to intention, yes, we are intentional, but we're not perfect. And I think it's something where, because we trust that the intention is to be equal and the intention is to be in this together, that we can come back to the conversation and say, whoa, this is really messed up, dude. We need to get this back on track. When can we do this? When can we have the conversation? When can we clean things up? Like whatever it is, and trusting that that's the case. Because you're like, oh, it's so intentional. And I'm like, it is, but it's messy. It's still messy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I heard a few things there. So one for sure is just the ability to talk about it takes away some of the fear around this big nebulous thing that really isn't that big and nebulous. It can have a lot of emotions tied to it. But the reality is when we look at money, I tell people all the time, I failed college algebra, right? But I do financial therapy because I so believe that money is mostly emotional and psychological. It is, yes, a little bit about the literacy, about the building blocks, but it is also just about how we relate to money. So I love, Curt, that you said, just talk about it, get comfortable being a little bit uncomfortable. And Katie, you adding on that intentionality doesn't mean perfection. And I think that will help to soothe some people who are listening in and are like, okay, so I'm still allowed to make mistakes, because I heard that kind of flowing underneath, but to call it out really succinctly, I think is important. What about words of wisdom you'd offer to somebody who's interested in getting into a business partnership with somebody else? What are some things that helped the two of you get on the same page? Or Curt, maybe you could share what not to do.
Having learned from my previous business relationship, it's making the time to talk about the process over and over. And that was one of the big mistakes from my first venture, is we didn't have regular set times to talk about what our investments were, talk about what our emotional and our labor investments were. And that has been something that Katie and I have done really well, is we're usually talking multiple times a week, not necessarily always about where our business is, but it's about knowing that we're both doing something towards our common goal. And really having the time to make it an actual partnership is something beyond in name only, that is the follow-through piece that makes something like this successful.
Great. Love it. Before we wrap up, what are some of the things what sort of pies are your thumbs in that are not professionally related? AKA, what are you guys doing for fun and joy right now?
Well, I'm doing a lot of sourdough baking. I know you and I have had this conversation a little bit on social, but I find that the work that I do, whether it's the stuff I do with Curt, it's therapy, it's consulting, there's some different things that I do. Most of it is thought work. And yes, there are objectives and metrics that you can see growth in, but it's still, I'm not working with my hands. It's usually not super tangible. And so for myself, I'll do home improvement projects, but then I'm really enjoying all this baking. It's something where, I literally am getting my hands dirty, and then they smell like sourdough all day, which is amazing. But it's something where I'm finding that it gives me a mindful, separate thing where at the end I have a loaf of bread, or I have bagels or croissants or whatever it is, just sitting there. And it also is delicious.
It is.
So for me, it's been, kind of either getting out in nature, doing something tangible, or doing something edible.
Yeah. Just using that other side of your brain.
Yes.
Is so important. Awesome. And Curt, what about you?
I have always found my peace in going running, and I have a past life of being an athlete and still dabble in races occasionally, but I have always found that my day gets recentered around getting up in the morning, going out before the world gets all busy, and finding my center there. So also just a place not to have to think.
Yeah.
So very much like Katie, getting out of my mind.
Love that. Well, Curt and Katie, where can everybody find more about you and your businesses?
Our podcast is the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. You can find that at mtsgpodcast.com and on pretty much all of the major podcast platforms. And our conference is the Therapy Reimagined Conference, therapyreimaginedconference.com. And that happens usually in the fall, sometime September, October, depending on the year. But we're really looking forward to continuing to push the envelope of conferences there. And you can find all of our updates there and on our social media.
Yes.
And we have our Facebook group where we announce our monthly happy hours, and that's the Modern Therapist group on Facebook.
Yay. Well, I will make sure that everybody has all of those links. I'm a huge fan of the podcast and also the conference. It was my first year attending and presenting this year, and I made some amazing connections with other therapists who were thinking outside of the box. So thank you both for creating that space. It has been so wonderful to see the community that you've built. And thank you again for sharing your wisdom today.
Absolutely.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having us.
I told you that would be a good one, right? I feel calmer, more intentional, and I feel like I've got permission to just cope with being imperfect, right? So the 3 takeaways I want to summarize here. The first one that I got from them is how they kind of push back against all of this noise. If you are in private practice, if you are in a business where you provide services, there's so much noise out there about investing, but sometimes it's just like freaking spending money. So their bar of where to spend their money and where not to spend their money comes down to a very basic ethos, and it's let's not lose money. And for them, it's really about, look, if they don't have the money, they are not comfortable taking out a loan or a credit card for it. And I want for you, if you are listening and you're hearing a bunch of noise about investing in yourself and about taking care of yourself, but it doesn't feel good or it feels like it's going to stretch you and that doesn't align with your values, then don't do it. For them, they really are conscious about what's important to them. And for them, when it comes to their podcast and their conference, it comes back to, are we delivering high quality education? If yes, pass go ahead and spend the money on it so long as they have the money. But if not, don't waste time and energy trying to make something super complex or trying to take out a bunch of loans and credit cards when it doesn't work for them. So that is the first takeaway, is if you don't have the money, don't spend it. And of course, that's obviously oversimplified, but use that as a very, very basic kind of tenet. And of course, everybody is different. Some people feel really comfortable taking out credit cards and loans and leveraging it, and that's all good if that's you. But if it's not, kudos. Don't lose money. If you don't have the money, don't spend it. The second takeaway is getting over the fear of talking about money. This has come up so many times with my guests. It came up with Tiffany McLean when she was talking about raising fees in her practice and just getting comfortable sitting with that discomfort. It also came up when speaking to Josie Rosario about talking about money with her family. And it's this idea that it often feels like such a big deal, but when we say the thing that is on our mind, it's often way less challenging or anxiety provoking than we imagine. So getting comfortable being uncomfortable and getting over the fear of talking about money. So many of us tiptoe around it when it's the elephant in the room. So I really appreciate them saying, like, we just talk about it. And if it's awkward or uncomfortable, it's all good. We know how to cope with it moving forward. And the third takeaway is the one that I feel like I was trying to get at throughout this conversation. I was like, how are you guys doing this? How are you being so freaking intentional? And Katie was like, look, intention doesn't mean we're perfect. Intention does not mean perfection. I was like, oh, thank you. Thank you for reminding of that. Is that you can set intentions, you can try your best, and sometimes that doesn't always work out. Curt talked about he'd had a failed business partnership before entering into these partnerships with Katie and what he learned from it. Katie talked about, look, intention for me is also thinking about what is the time investment, not just the financial investment. So for you, if you're not a therapist, if you're not in a service-based profession where you're worrying about the business side of money, how can you take this takeaway and implement it in your life of, I set an intention of spending 20% less this month, or I set an intention of increasing my retirement contributions by 3%. And those intentions didn't work out. And that's okay. It doesn't mean I failed. It means that I set a goal or I set an intention for myself and it didn't work out. And what can I do? How can I learn from it? And how can I maybe let it go? Maybe that intention wasn't right for me or wasn't right for me right now. And that is perfectly okay. So again, huge shout out to Curt and Katie for being here today. It was such a joy to speak with them. And if you want to check out my episode with them, you can just search for Financial Therapy, Lindsay Bryan-Podvin on their podcast, The Modern Therapist Survival Guide. And if you are a therapist and consider yourself a modern therapist, definitely check out their Therapy Reimagined conference. It's again going to be virtual in 2021. And if you are listening to this before February 15th, you should apply to speak at that conference. They have so many different tracks, so you can present more of a teaching or a clinical track. You can present on more of a self-care track. They have a track for misfits and outcasts in the therapy world. So there are so many different ways to get involved. And maybe it's not for you to apply, but I would just encourage you to get closer to that edge. It's not pushing yourself past it. It's not harming yourself. But if you're a therapist and you're like, you know what, I do have something to say that I think other therapists would be interested in, definitely check out that website, submit your application by February 15th of 2021. And with that, I will see you right here, same place, same time next week. If you love this episode, take a screenshot and tag me on Instagram at MindMoneyBalance with your favorite takeaway. I love seeing what resonates with my listeners and sharing it in my stories. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'll see you next week right here. Neither the host or guests are rendering legal, accounting, clinical, medical, or other professional information. If you want professional help, please seek it out.